York Times in September of 1865. It was about wool, and this is what they wrote. We have yet to speak of the satinet, peculiarly a creation of Yankee economy. If we may resort to the stage for a metaphor and depict broadcloth, dark, heavy, sumptuous, as the tragedy of manufacture, and casimere, varied, diverse, brilliant as its comedy, nothing remains but to describe the satinet, deceptive, pretentious, imitative as its farce. Yet we would not be understood as deriding the satinet. Economy presided at its birth, and the dress of millions of our people every day demonstrates its utility. Even when cotton was at the enormous figures of 1864, the marvelous strength supplied to woolen fillings by cotton work at the well-known economy of weight continued the satinet in full favor with the immense army of low-priced buyers. It supplies, and chiefly supplies, the laborer with his shiny blue or black Sunday suit and his gray Melton working dress. The spinning and weaving of cotton cloth gets much of the attention in the early history of the Industrial Revolution, but running parallel to that were small woolen mills, although the woolen industry got started a little bit after the cotton industry. Many of the early woolen mills produced satinet, a cloth with a cotton warp and a woolen weft. What was satinet, and what was it used for? It was generally described as, quote, goods made on a cotton warp with a weft of wool. They are of low cost but of comparatively durable quality, and furnish clothing of low price and of sightly appearance. A later reference defines its use, a material used almost exclusively in the manufacture of men's ready-made clothing. Satinet appears to have been predominantly used for trousers or pantaloons, but also as lining for coats and jackets, for uniforms during the Civil War, and by whalemen off of the Massachusetts coast. It's based on the satin weave structure for U-weavers, 5 or 6 shafts, lifting 1 shaft per pick, with the result that the wool weft predominates on the top and the cotton weft on the underside, which you'll see when you see the sample. It's slayed more densely than plain weave, as the filling goes over 5 under 1 and is packed tightly. So as you can also see, I changed the dates on this somewhat, because as I go like that, yes. Okay. So here are drafts from some weavers' books of the period of early manufacture. The first one is from Bronson's Manufacturer's Assistant, and it gives complete instructions for how to weave satinet. It tells you what kind of yarn to use. It tells you the weave structure. And the second is from another book of the same period, Philo Blakeman's Weaver's Assistant. Before the Revolutionary War, colonists wore primarily English wools. After the war, there was an urgency to manufacture domestically. Satinet filled that niche for domestically produced wool fabric before power looms to weave all wool fabrics were developed. Satinet production took advantage of the availability of machine-spun cotton yarn, which was suddenly everywhere. It was often locally marketed. For example, a mill on Martha's Vineyard made satinet for sailors' coats, and a mill in Iowa manufactured it to clothe residents of the local penitentiary. So we go back to the deep local here, where it was very much made and sold locally. The satinet period I've revised to be more like 1810 to 1890. And I'm a wool weaver. I live in Massachusetts, and I really hadn't thought about satinet at all until I read Arthur Cole's book, American Wool Manufacture, which was published in 1920, and he talks about the fact that by 1830, satinet represented half of all wool cloth manufactured in the United States. Now, granted, in 1830, not that much wool cloth was being manufactured in the United States, but still that was significant. It was eventually replaced by all wool fabrics such as cashmere, flannel, and worsted, but for a brief period it was very important. So here's a picture of Satinet as it might have looked on a bolt of cloth, and you can clearly see the cotton warp on the back and the wool weft on the front. I'm from Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the epicenter of Satinet production, both for being where it probably originated and spread, and for the amounts produced. It was manufactured literally anywhere there was water power and sheep, and Massachusetts had both. It coincided with a boom with sheep raising in New England, with the importation of the merino breed beginning in 1810. In 1845, there were more than 80 mills making satinet in Massachusetts. So as a weaver, working primarily with wool, living in Massachusetts, this was really intriguing to me. And I went looking for whatever I could find about satinet, and I found that artifacts are really scarce. So I went looking for other evidence such as photographs, histories of mills, written records which included letters. And I found a wonderful collection of Hollingsworth family letters. The Hollingsworths were a British family that came over in 1825 or so, and one of the sons was a really prolific letter writer. He was constantly writing home to his family in England, and in November 20th of 1830, he wrote that he had finished 50 yards of satinet, and November 8th, he'd finished 200 yards more. So that told me that at that point he's working on a power loom. And he also described the looms that he used, which were, quote, stout iron side for cotton shirtings. And I'm interpreting that as perhaps they were originally cotton looms that were adapted for woolen shuttles, larger shuttles, because the looms to weave wool were quite a bit developed after the original cotton looms. I started looking for other references, and the Merino Wool Factory in Dudley, Massachusetts kept track of payments to weavers, and satinet was originally manufactured under the putting out system, where mills would provide a weaver with the cotton warp and the wool, and the weavers would take it home and hand weave it. So here's a reference from the Merino Wool Factory, and you can see Joanna Davis, for example, was paid for 26 3/4 yards of satinet, and that would have been a typical length warp for a hand loom. I found later references from the day book of the Butler and Mills company in Williamstown, Massachusetts in 1838, and they both recorded sales of satinet, where they typically sell about 2.5 yards at a time, which was about what you need for a pair of pants. And also they had payments to a weaver, Robert Howson, who was weaving at that point quite a bit more, 531 yards, and that tells me both from the date and from the quantity that he was weaving that he was weaving on a power loom at that point. I went looking for more evidence of satinet production in census reports, especially the Massachusetts statistics on industry, which they kept from 1835 to 1865, and they detailed how many yards of what were produced in how many mills in which towns. Wow, you can follow all that. And So that's where I got the figure that there were 80 mills, for example, producing Satinet in 1845. So I also started to find evidence of Satinet production in historical photographs. And this, oh, wait a minute. You didn't get that one yet. There's the 531 yards. This photograph is from 1888, also Massachusetts, and it's the Taft Mill in Oxford. And they were producing incredible quantities of Satinet at a very late period, which surprised me, but I guess I want to emphasize that it was a very functional, cheap fabric that people had need for into the 1890s or so. This mill is now gone, but they produced 300,000 yards a year, which translates to about 1,000 yards a day. And here's a photograph from the inside of the mill. These are all the weavers in front of their looms, and you can see stacks of the fabric next to them. And this is also from the same mill. The weavers are now gone, and the men standing there are the owner, who's the guy with the hat, and presumably the loom fixers. And what I love about this photograph is that it shows you the warp in the looms, and you can see clearly that it's a white warp, and yet the stacks of fabric are dark. So that's the Satinet wool weft that you're seeing on that. Many Satinet mills were small. Mills might have only 3 or 4 looms and an output of somewhere around 10,000 yards of fabric a year. In my area of western Massachusetts, there were small Satinet mills in Shelburne, Rowe, Conway, Greenfield, Cummington, and Northampton, as well as further west in Williamstown, Plain, Pittsfield, and North Adams. The Franklin okay. So here's a picture of an early Satinet loom. And this was made by the Crompton Loom Works, who were also in Massachusetts. And you could see from looking at the picture that there were only 6 shafts on the loom, which was a Satinet structure. In my area, there's in a little town north of me, there was the Franklin Manufacturing Company of Rowe. And this is a tag that they would have used to sell the fabric. A lot of it was sold locally. In 1837, they only made 10,000 yards of Satinet using 7,500 pounds of wool. At that time, there were 2,000 sheep in town. And it's a pretty remote place. It's up high. But there were 2,000 sheep. This is the center of town. And in the far right corner, you see the mill. And then there was also workers' housing in town. But it wasn't a big mill. It doesn't exist anymore. There's a close-up of the mill. It came down in the early 1900s. But you can see the water wheel there. So a lot of these early Satinet mills were water-powered. Here's another mill that was a bit larger in my area. This was the Conway Manufacturing Company, and they made 87,600 yards in 1845 with 62,000 pounds of wool. And certainly that wasn't all grown right in the area, so they would have been bringing wool in. But what's interesting, this company went on to make cashmere later. So this is sort of showing the transition from that mills made from making Satinet to making kind of a higher end fabric later. In the McLean report, the first U.S. government census of manufacturers in 1832, the question was asked of manufacturers where they sold their products. The answers occasionally mentioned southern states coupled with a less expensive price, which would seem to indicate that it was also made and sold for slave clothing. And to corroborate this, a runaway slave notice from 1852 described the man as wearing black satinet pantaloons. Emily Dickinson supplies a rare mention of using satinet for an article of women's clothing. In a letter, she writes of sewing a jacket for her mother. "I'm sure I feel as Noah did, docile but somewhat skeptic under the satinet." And I don't know how to interpret that. But she was doing this in 1863 during the Civil War, so it's possible that other wool fabric was not available to her, but it wasn't typically used for women's clothing. So I have been looking and looking for physical evidence. Few artifacts remain, and this illustration from a novel from 1881 perhaps describes why. And the mother is holding up this pair of pants from her rag bag, and she describes them as a pair of gray satinets, and they're weak in the knees, but she's thinking that maybe she's going to use them for braiding into a rug. At the same time, there was a huge market in shoddy, making shoddy, and so I think a lot of satinet probably got recycled into that. It may also exist as the backs of quilts. I don't know, but you can't tell until you take something apart, because you do have to be able to see both sides of it. One example that I found was in Iowa, in the Jackson County Historical Museum in Maquoketa, Iowa. They have pieces from the Eagle Woolen Mill, and this was some commission weave fabric that they'd made for the local penitentiary. It was so exciting to me because you can look at this. The curator took a photograph. I haven't seen it in the flesh, and she folded it over, and I thought, oh, Satinet, because there you see the cotton warp on the back. Satinet was manufactured in a variety of ways. It wasn't just the plain cloth that you, for example, saw in from the Oxford Mill. There's all kinds of different styles described, slightly different weave structures, and some of it was striped. And so just for fun, I wove some that I made into this jacket, and it has, on the back, it has a striped warp, and then it has a striped weft in it as well. The only piece that I've actually seen in the flesh was a Confederate frock coat, which is in the Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. William Hodge was captured as a prisoner of war in 1862, and his coat was preserved and ended up at the museum here. Is to see areas of where the moths have gotten into the wool, but not into the work, the weft, but not into the work. And this is the back side of the jacket. This happened to be an unlined jacket, so it was identified online, okay, as Satinet, which there's not a lot. Evidence of mills. This is that mill, or it still exists on Martha's Vineyard, and it's now the garden club. But and finally, a mill in Missouri, the Watkins Woolen Mill, which is now a state historic site, and not only is the building preserved, but also the balloon. Okay.